Hey everyone, welcome back to the Layback Podcast. Just going to let you know right up front, today is going to be pretty different. This is going to be likely the last time you hear from me on this episode, as today we are actually going to be sharing our Tuesday, June 10th Zoom webinar that we hosted for Jessica Geiger, a recent graduate of Wake Forest Biomedical Engineering program, where she did research on the forearm flexor muscles and elbow joint gapping changes that occur after a forearm strengthening protocol. That forearm strengthening protocol was specific to FlexPro Grip training. Now, joining Jessica is going to be Dr. Matt Fury as our moderator of the webinar. And then panelists include Ryan Yoshida and Dylan Newcomer. So Dr. Matt Fury, previous podcast guest, as well as the physical therapist, both Dylan Newcomer and Ryan Yoshida. They have been on the podcast as well. Really looking forward to this discussion. And then in a couple weeks, we'll actually have Jessica on to share the more personal side of the study. So maybe get into some details, maybe things that she found really interesting, or just kind of how she reacted throughout the process. Because so much in scientific research is hard data that we don't really get to hear how the researcher felt throughout the entire process. So we'll tackle that stuff down the line. This episode is going to be very analytical, very data driven, and I highly suggest that you tune in on a visual platform, whether it's YouTube or Spotify, so you can watch along because there are going to be some shared slides, there's going to be some graphs, and certainly with a few people on, it feels more comforting maybe to see reactions or interactions throughout the process. So thanks again, guys, for tuning in. And as always, thanks for laying back with us.
All right, it's 11:01 here, so I think we've got a good group of folks that have joined in our list here. So some people are joining from their calendar links, but we're going to be respectful of everybody's time and get rolling. So I'd like to welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us. This is going to be an opportunity for us. We're hosting a webinar to discuss some interesting research findings. Jessica Geiger is going to be joining us and presenting some of the work that she has been working on over the past year. And really the purpose of collecting everybody here today is to get the expertise of Dylan and Ryan, who I'll introduce just shortly. And we're here for a common goal, really. Our goal is to try and collaborate, to learn from each other, and seek ways for us to support our athletes, support their performance while trying to minimize the risk of elbow injuries, which, as we know, costs a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears. And it's an unfortunate situation for our athletes when we find them in this situation. And so a couple housekeeping notes before we get going. This Zoom call is going to last an hour. We're going to be respectful of everybody's time. Now, that being said, we have a chat opportunity here at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please put any questions in the chat. We're going to try and bounce our questions off of our panelists. We're going to answer anything that we can. If there are questions that we cannot get to, we plan to collect these in the form of a delayed question answer, a Q&A that will then circulate to the folks who had RSVP'd. So hopefully we can address everybody's questions or concerns. The meeting will be recorded. We're going to notify everybody how they can access this meeting. But with that being said, 11:03, I think it's time for us to get started. So for starters, my name is Matt Fury. I'm an orthopedic surgeon in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm team physician for LSU Athletics and a clinical instructor at the LSU Department of Orthopedics. Former baseball player who's always been passionate about shoulder elbow health and the health of the overhead athlete. So this is certainly a passion of mine. But we are joined today by really just a fantastic panel. And so I'm going to do a brief introduction, but I'd also like to hear from them and give them the opportunity to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their purpose and their mission. But first up is Dylan Newcomer, who's a physical therapist. He's the head PT over at Driveline in Washington. Originally was trained as a strength coach, and he is the owner and operator of Athletic Potential Performance Physical Therapy. Dylan is a good friend, somebody I consider an expert in the management of UCL rehab. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to have him here and hear from his perspective. But Dylan, is there anything else you'd like to add for the people listening?
No, I think you hit for the most part on the head. Like you said, I'm the PT at Driveline up in Seattle, and I kind of oversee all of the operations here as far as managing athlete health. I also get the opportunity to run my own clinic inside the gym where I get to treat the local Seattle Tacoma area, and the athletes of that space. Um, my kind of journey with FlexPro probably began about a year and a half ago or so when I met with Daryl, and ever since then, he and I have been constantly in communication about how we can better use this piece of technology to enhance the health of the athletes. And it's been a very transformational experience for me, both from a clinical standpoint and just learning a ton from all of the stuff that can come with this device and the research that's backing it, which Jess will be bringing to us today. So that's good for me. I'll let Ryan take the show from here.
So I think Dylan brings up a good point. We're going to introduce Ryan, but just for starters, we're going to be discussing the FlexPro Grip device as part of Jess's research, which was performed at Wake Forest and not affiliated with the company in any way. And for us and for me personally as a panelist, I have no financial conflict of interest with the device, more of a conflict of passion and bias. This is something that I care about the health of our throwing athletes and finding ways that we can potentially minimize our risk. And I see that, the device could potentially be useful in this category. So I just think it's important for conflict purposes to state that for the listeners here. So now that brings us to our next panelist is Ryan Yoshida. He's a physical therapist as well, former MLB assistant rehab coordinator and a therapist with the Dodgers, founder of the Armored Heat app, which is a fantastic resource providing daily arm care, strengthening, and has really maximized his impact all over the game at youth, collegiate, professional level. So, Ryan, thanks for joining us. Give us a little more insight into your background.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And yeah, but you kind of hit the nail on the head. The intro from 2017 to 2022 was with the Dodgers, worked various roles there from minor league physical therapist and finished, as you mentioned, as the assistant rehab coordinator and major league side of things. And then from there, I started Armored Heat, which is an arm strengthening, mobility, and recovery app. We serve individual athletes from the major league level down to the high school amateur level, and then also at the team side of things at the college level. So that's kind of where my passion's been at, especially the last couple of years. And something that really drew me to this conversation specifically was we've all seen this increase in injuries, and so much of the researcher bandwidth was going after, okay, well, why are there more stresses? Guys are throwing harder. Guys, is it the spin? Is it sweeper? So much of it was on the cause side of things. And then when you're looking at it, not in a vacuum, in my opinion, is we're putting so much bandwidth onto things that also make these guys better pitchers, that they're going to accept that risk a lot of times, like velocity. Higher velocity is going to the arm, more stress. And then, so we're putting so much bandwidth and research into researching that side of things. And now to see stuff coming out on the other side of things, on how can we make these athletes as resilient as possible to handle the stresses, I think that's a much better way, kind of as Jessica mentioned, to tie in having that increased performance and then also be able to keep guys healthy as well. So that's something that really drew me into this, and then the FlexPro Grip as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. I think we're going to dive into some of those concepts too as we have some follow-up conversation. But it's time to introduce really the reason why we're here is to kind of collaborate, analyze, discuss Jessica Geiger. So Jessica she completed her bachelor's in mechanical engineering at Virginia Tech, was performing a master's in biomedical engineering at Wake Forest. She is working with Kristen Nicholson over at the Wake Forest pitching lab. Dr. Nicholson is an assistant professor of orthopedic surgery at Wake. And I'm going to give Jessica some opportunity to tell a little bit of background about herself. And then she's going to introduce her research project and provide us with a formal research presentation that we've all gathered here to hear and to learn from. So, Jess, if you don't mind, let's take the floor and introduce a little bit more about you, and then we'll get going.
I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen because I've got this all in a presentation now. So thumbs up if you're all looking at my slides at the moment. Awesome. All right. So today I will be presenting on some work that I did a part of my master's thesis titled Forearm Flexor Muscle and Elbow Joint Gap Changes After a Forearm Strengthening Protocol, which we all know is the FlexPro Grip. And so a little bit about me, like Matt said, I got my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Virginia Tech. I got my master's degree in biomedical engineering through it's a combo program, the Virginia Tech Wake Forest biomedical engineering program. And as it was discussed, I did my research in the Wake Forest pitching lab, and all of this research was a part of my master's thesis. I did some other research as well, but I thought the FlexPro Grip was a great way to integrate my passion for biomechanics and injury recovery prevention, and just to help out athletes and people in general. I also was a data processing engineer with Kinetitrax while I was in grad school and completing my research. And then in just about 2 weeks now, I'll be starting my new position at New Balance in Boston, Massachusetts, where I'll be a sports research engineer intern there. And I'm super duper excited for that. And then before I do discuss some of this research, I want to acknowledge a few people who are massive contributors to this project and helped me out a ton. As I said earlier, Dr. Nicholson, she was just the core person to this. She was my advisor. She was a mentor. Overall, she was so amazing, and she helped me out so much with this and guiding me through the process. Dr. Pexa from High Point University, he helped me out a ton with the ultrasonography side of this project, as well as some of the statistical analyses, giving me some advice there. And then lastly, Blake Jones, he is a medical student. He's in his 4th year, and he was another helping hand on the side. He was very, he went under the radar, but he helped me out a ton, just giving me advice on doing thesis work, but also research in general and this project. So without further ado, I will get started, and this will be a little bit repetitive for you all. As you know, baseball injuries are extremely important to address, as well as elbow injuries. And as the pitching motion does induce such a high stress to the medial elbow, we need to figure out a way that we can eliminate these injuries. So the common way we fix this is through the Tommy John surgery, but this puts players on the injured list for over 74 days, and they can even not return to their sport. And so there's many risk factors that we have identified, like pitch velocity, pitch volume, and percentage of fastballs thrown, as well as their pitching mechanics, but this varies by style and anatomy, both impacting the valgus load to the medial elbow. And before I get into this further, I do want to discuss the difference between the valgus and the varus torque, as this is a term I'll be using a lot. The valgus torque is the external force that pushes the elbow outwards. This stresses the medial elbow and it compresses the lateral elbow. This is most prominent when the pitcher is in their arm cocking phase and when the shoulder is maximally externally rotated. And this high valgus torque can lead to UCL sprains or tears. The varus torque is the internal force or the moment that resists the valgus torque. This is generated by the UCL itself and the surrounding musculature, specifically the flexor pronator group. This stabilizes the medial elbow against that valgus torque that the elbow experiences during the pitching motion. Furthermore, looking at the UCL, we know that the anterior band is the primary restraint to that valgus force. And because the UCL is made of a collagen fiber arrangement and those fibers are arranged in parallel, it makes that ligament very good at resisting pulling forces. It does not make it very good at twisting, which, as we know, a pitcher is rotating through the motion and the ligament does twist and turn, and it's not very good at that. So when and why do UCLs tear? Well, they're most prominent to tear in that maximum external rotation position. But also there are micro tears and that can build up within the ligament from these high torques and forces. That ligament doesn't necessarily need to tear on one pitch. These can build up. But the ultimate failure occurs when the valgus forces exceed the UCL's tensile strength. And so much of our literature has indicated that these tears are caused by a torque that exceeds the UCL's tensile limit. And high-level pitchers are pitching at about 80 to 100 miles per hour, and the torque that they experience is between 80 and 100 Newton meters, excuse me. But the ligament can only withstand about 34 Newton meters. So we need to address this through other methods. And so today I'll be discussing how the FlexPro Grip addresses this through the muscle tendon units surrounding the UCL. These are the primary dynamic stabilizers that can withstand the force that a player experiences when pitching. and they take off some of that 80 to 100 Newton meters that a player will experience, as the UCL can only withstand 34 Newton meters. So, like I said, the medial elbow is supported by this flexor pronator group, and they resist that large valgus force. And in order to assess the strength of the elbow, we can look at something called medial elbow ulnohumeral joint gapping, which is something I'll be looking at in this study. This will help us determine whether or not the elbow is well stabilized and able to take on those loads. And a good way that we can assess dynamic elbow gapping as well as static elbow gapping is through ultrasonography. It's extremely cost efficient. You're able to easily assess dynamic loads. And so the purpose of this study was to investigate changes in ulnohumeral joint gapping and muscle cross-sectional area when utilizing the FlexPro Grip. So to begin, the FlexPro Grip specifically targets three muscles in the forearm: the flexor digitorum profundus, the flexor digitorum superficialis, and the flexor carpi ulnaris, which are the three muscles we measured in this study. Regarding my methods, this was a prospective cohort study. There was a cohort that utilized the FlexPro Grip, and then there was a control group, and this was all taken during their fall on ramping period. The inclusion criteria for this study was that they were all Division I male baseball pitchers, and that each participant had no pain and full participation during their fall on ramping period. Players were excluded from this study if they were either not compliant with the protocol, were injured in not throwing before or during the study, or acquired an injury during the study that did prevent them from training and enacting in their normal day-to-day training. The variables that we measured in this study were elbow gapping, forearm flexor muscle cross-sectional area, grip strength, and forearm girth. The materials we utilized were a GE Logic ultrasound system. This is what we used to measure the muscle cross-sectional area as well as the elbow gapping. A 2.5 kilogram arm weight was used to induce that valgus load. A grip dynamometer, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, that was used to measure the grip strength, and a manual goniometer to place the elbow, as well as a tape measure. Just some general procedures. This data was collected prior to and after a 10-week protocol. No measurements were made in between. Also, some surveys were taken before and after the protocol was completed regarding player history, injury, participation, pain, injury, and illness. For the FlexPro Grip training plan, there was the players who utilized the training plan used a periodized ramp-up training protocol of the player's maximum voluntary contraction and completed A, B, and C days, in which A days were fingertip flexion of the four fingers combined, B days were extension of four fingers combined, and C days were the mid finger of the four fingers combined, all having some sort of ulnar deviation, radial deviation, flexion, and extension. Regarding the data collection procedures, grip strength was collected again with that manual goniometer, and then the maximum forearm girth was measured at the maximal point of the forearm before and after the protocol. Ulnohumeral joint gapping was measured in millimeters and measured in the loaded and unloaded conditions at 30 and 90 degrees of elbow flexion. The 2.5 kilogram arm weight was utilized to induce the varus load there, and this was totally safe and okay to use, as this was about less than 1/10 of the load that pitchers do experience when they are throwing. For the muscle cross-sectional area of the FDS, FDP, and FCU, this was measured with the subject at rest, lying supine, with the shoulder abducted at 90 degrees and the elbow flexed at 30 degrees. The location of the transducer was placed at 20% proximal from the medial epicondyle of the humerus to the ulnar styloid process. Regarding the ultrasound processing, image J was utilized to process these images, which you can see in A, B, C, and D. This is the medial elbow. There were 2 images taken per medial elbow condition, and the side-to-side distance was measured, which was defined as the shortest distance from the distal medial corner of the trochlea to the proximal edge of the sublime tubercle. Some Measurements that were calculated were D30 and D90, which is defined as the change in gapping, which equals the loaded distance minus the unloaded. And so from here on out, I will refer to these terms as D30 and D90 at 30 degrees of flexion and 90 degrees of flexion. For the muscle cross-sectional area, each muscle was hand traced and outlined, looking at their fascial lines as well as their general shape, but this was for the FDP, FCU, and FDS. And this was all done in ImageJ as well, where the program calculated the area. For my statistical analysis, I utilized RStudio. A demographic t-test was used to see if the two cohorts were similar in terms of basic characteristics like height, weight, and age. And this will see if the body size might affect the results. For reliability, I calculated an interclass correlate coefficient, which tells us how consistent the measurements were when repeated, which higher ICC is equivalent to a more trustworthy data set. The standard error of the mean, or SEM, shows us how much the numbers might vary by chance. A lower SEM is better precision. I then completed a two-way mixed ANOVA with an alpha at 0.05. This is a test that checks how two things might affect the results, that being a FlexPro Grip versus a control. And I measured between group and within time. So this assessed differences between the people within the two cohorts and the changes over time within these cohorts. I also utilized a greenhouse geyser correction, which is used when data doesn't necessarily follow the rules of an ANOVA. This will keep the results accurate. Lastly, I did some post-hoc testing within this ANOVA. This is just some extra testing to find out exactly where these differences are between the cohorts. The Bonferroni correction keeps us from getting maybe tricked by random chance when there are lots of tests that are being run. And lastly, a Cohen's d effect size was calculated, which is a way that we can measure how big the difference is. This allows us to quantify it. And it tells us if a difference is not just real, but also if it's a meaningful difference between those two cohorts. All right, so this is what everyone's interested in, the results and discussion. So to start off, this is my demographical data between the two cohorts. So we actually had exactly the same amount going forward. We had 18 in the FlexPro Grip group and 18 in the control. Overall, there were no significant differences between the FlexPro Grip and the control groups in weight, height, or valgus moment that those players experienced, except for age. But overall, this indicates that the two cohorts were of comparable anthropometric characteristics. While age did show a difference, we saw that the FlexPro Grip group was younger. They had more underclassmen than the control group, which means they could have been less trained, but we're not 100% sure about that one. That's just something to note about that. But looking forward, reliability, the reliability of measuring it showed amazing reliability. I'm not an ultrasonographer, but I practiced a lot and I was very consistent with my results. And so this high reliability shows us that the measurements were reliable and that we can trust what we are seeing. And the standard error of the mean also remained low for their respective measurements. This is the two-way mixed ANOVA results. And as we can see, there were significant interactions between the group and time for all conditions, except for the unloaded ulnohumeral joint gapping at 30 degrees of flexion. So this will not be included in post-hoc testing. So this is a very big table. I know it's extremely overwhelming, but what we want to look at specifically are these highlighted points. This is the significant interaction effect class. So this is after we complete that post-hoc testing to eliminate any differences that can occur. More specifically, I want us to look at the FlexPro pre to FlexPro post. These are where the most significant changes occurred in my ANOVA testing. And this shows us that there is an overwhelming difference that the pre to post FlexPro Grip guys did show. While there were some differences between the control pre to control post, they're extremely minor and not of significant value to us. Also looking at our Cohen's d effect sizes, this was very telling. This allows us to quantify and assess if these values are meaningful and if the changes are meaningful. And the FlexPro Grip group showed an overwhelming amount of moderate to large effect sizes from before to after their protocol for the change in joint gapping D90 as well as their muscle cross-sectional area. The control group maintained weak to small effect sizes. So this tells us, this cohort did not experience a significant amount of change. So this is a really great slide. This really demonstrates the changes that these two cohorts experienced. On the left is D30, which again is that change in medial joint gapping, the loaded minus the unloaded at 30 degrees. And then on the right is at 90 degrees. The FlexPro Grip group is in that teal color and the control group is in the orange. And for 30 degrees of elbow flexion, the FlexPro Grip group showed an overwhelming decrease of about 42%, whereas the control group actually increased their change in joint gapping at 25%. At 90 degrees, the FlexPro group also decreased significantly at 43%, whereas the control group increased about 13%. And the thing I love about this graph is that these two cohorts actually started at an extremely similar point. You can see they're starting on the left is the precondition, and they have an extremely similar change in joint gapping for both 30 and 90 degrees. But what we can see for both conditions is that the FlexPro Grip group had a significant decrease in change in joint gapping size, whereas the control group either increased a bit or they actually maintained quite a linear change in joint gap. Looking at the muscle cross-sectional area, the FlexPro Grip group, again in that teal color, showed significant increases among all these forearm flexors. For the FDS, the FlexPro Grip group had about 21% increase. For the FDP, they had about 38%, and the FCU about 11%. Looking at that control, they maintained very negligible change, under 10% change, which to us was not significant, and they clearly did not have any decrease or increase here. So in conclusion, what we found with all of these results, that the FlexPro Grip is an effective training device. This device allows for these players to have an increased elbow stability as well as forearm strength. This device helped that cohort decrease their ulnohumeral joint gapping as well as increase that muscle cross-sectional area. Some limitations to this study is that this study only included Division I collegiate pitchers, and looking at other ages and sizes of players might be of significance. Also, this study had a smaller sample size of only 18 per cohort. A larger sample size would allow us to understand how this is changing more effectively among the players. Also, I could not account for any muscle activation which may have occurred when that weight was applied to the pitcher's forearm. And lastly, sometimes the ultrasound images, they're very difficult to measure and analyze for those players who may have had Tommy John surgery. And they weren't necessarily always the clearest, but I did try my best every time. And lastly, I think some future work would be great if you could get a large sample size. 50 plus players would be amazing for both cohorts. Also, I think it would be interesting to have some more frequent check-in measurements. Like I said, I only measured before and after that 10-week protocol, but perhaps a weekly check-in or bi-weekly check-in would help us understand more how the joint gapping as well as muscle cross-sectional area is changing over time. Lastly, I think this would be an interesting study to look at with players who may have already sustained elbow injuries versus those who do not. My study contained players who did already have a Tommy John surgery as well as players who do not have that. So I think that difference there would be very interesting to assess. So thank you so much all for listening. And now we'll take some questions. I have my contact information in the bottom left-hand corner if anyone needs to reach out to me. But I'm happy to start up the panel now.
Jess, thank you so much for your, number one, all your hard work that went into that study. That's a labor of love for sure. And so you should be applauded for all the work that you did. We're going to get to a couple questions. We already have a few brewing in the chat. I think one real quick that we should get to, Jess, there's a question for some clarification on the participants between the two cohorts. Did they go through a standardized throwing program during the fall for their ramp up, or were they allowed to do their preferred or team directed program based off of their distance intensity? Basically, question regarding baseline characteristics between the two cohorts. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, so again, they were both of Division I collegiate level. They were instructed to follow their fall on-ramping training that their pitching coach or head coach provided to them. I did not oversee what their fall on-ramping contained, but I do know that they did have some sort of intensive training, and they were both on-ramping for their spring season.
But it's an important point, right? It's a good question to bring up, is that there's an observational nature to the study, right? And so there are some other exposure factors that can contribute here with regards to what their individual workloads were in their team environments and how that may have an effect on the findings. That being said, I think, yeah, but the statistical analysis that you did does demonstrate with the Cohen-D analysis the size of the effect here. And you would think that some of these would be smaller factors, while you found moderate to large effect on some of the muscle cross-sectional area. Couple follow-up questions for you, Jess. Number one, why did you decide to measure gapping at 30 degrees and 90 degrees of flexion? How were those decisions made?
Definitely. Great question. So the elbow was measured at 30 degrees because studies in the past have shown this is where the medial elbow does experience the highest amount of valgus and varus load, and the UCL is most exposed to that force. However, I wanted to also measure at 90 degrees because when pitchers are throwing, they're typically up in that 90 degrees of elbow flexion. And so this is where pitchers are most commonly experiencing their varus and valgus loads to the medial elbow. And so that is why I measured at those angles.
Great. And why do you think that you saw a significant shift in joint gapping between the training group? What is your post analysis here? How do you hypothesize that effect was seen?
So we didn't see necessarily a ton of significant difference between the standalone measurements. So if we're just looking at 90 degrees of elbow flexion unloaded or 90 degrees of elbow flexion loaded. However, what we're concerned with when baseball pitchers are throwing is how their elbow joint is opening up and closing, as the throwing motion is a dynamic motion. And we want to understand how the ligament is being exposed to forces and undertaking loads. And so I think with the FlexPro Grip group, because they strengthened those forearm muscles, they were better able to withstand the load. And so when their elbow was opening up and being exposed to that valgus load, the medial elbow did not need to open up as much because their forearm flexor muscles were taking on that load instead of the UCL itself.
So you think it was the underlying change of the flexor musculature? That's why we were seeing joint gapping differences.
Yeah, I think because the flexor muscles were able to bear that load more instead of the elbow being exposed to it. And so because the forearm flexors were taking on that load, the elbow did not need to open up as much.
Fantastic. Well, look, what we're going to do is we're going to recap from the panel side of things, some initial takeaways from Jess's presentation, and we're really getting some questions stacking up in the chat here too as well. There's a lot of interest and people would like some follow-up, so hopefully we'll work through that. For me personally, I think, Jess, again, you did a fantastic job. I think this is some great work where we think about how can we modulate stress to the medial elbow and what is modifiable and what's not, right? And we know that the velocity demands are not really modifiable at this point. The stress is going to be seen. How can we affect that? And so we know the underlying ligament changes over the course of a season with regards to thickness, elasticity, but we don't really know how to intervene there or if there are things that we can do to change the properties of the ligament. But it would make sense that the overlying flexor pronator musculature is ripe for attack as clinicians and therapists and training staff, the opportunity for us to strengthen the muscle group to diminish the underlying stress that's being delivered to the ligament. So I think that what you've shown in this study, which is really well done, was that there's a potential that we can treat with a training protocol, which we'll get to a little bit later, and potentially intervene upon the overlying musculature. Why don't we start with Dylan? Dylan, can you give us your initial takeaways after hearing Jess's presentation?
Yeah, I mean, my initial takeaways are that this is, based off of all the research that went into the development of the training protocols, this is kind of what I would expect to see and I'm happy to see kind of as the outcome. I see a few questions in the chat that are asking about specifically FlexPro Grip, but I think it's important that the takeaway is that the style of training that was done doesn't necessarily demand that the FlexPro Grip be involved, but that it's that we're attacking the tissue in a very specific manner that creates these changes in the tissue that is potentially going to protect the UCL better. The FlexPro Grip just offers an easy way to do it because it's specifically designed for that. And later on, we can jump into a few of the other questions about what that protocol actually looks like. But biggest takeaway is that when you intensely train the forearm flexors in the correct way, you create an adaptation that is most likely going to protect the UCL better.
And Ryan, how about you? Initial takeaways from Jess's presentation.
Yeah, great job, Jess. And really when my brain goes straight to like application wise and boil it down to like the simplest math problem, like what's going to not prevent that medial elbow from opening up. You have the bony aspects of the joint, you have the ligament, and you have the flexor musculature. And so which is trainable, I think we can confidently say like the bony part's not going to be super trainable. UCL, to Matt's point, like maybe we don't know yet, but the flexor musculature, very trainable. And so now it's like, okay, well, now which protocols can most effectively do that to shield some of that stress off the ligament. And so that was kind of my initial takeaway.
Agree. And just to clarify, there was a question in the chat. So Jess, your findings were that there was increased cross-sectional area of the overlying flexor pronator musculature after a training protocol. And in addition to the increased cross-sectional area, there was decreased ulnohumeral joint space gapping seen. So
especially in change in joint gapping, the loaded minus the unloaded condition.
Yes. So just to clarify for some of the folks in the chat here. So the idea is that the overlying flexor pronator is being trained and having a beneficial effect, whether that's stiffness or other muscular properties, right? They weren't directly measured here, but affecting the underlying ulnohumeral joint space gapping. So we do have a couple of questions that we would like to get through, and please keep them coming within the chat. There were multiple questions about the protocol. I think what we should say is we should give an overview of the training protocol. And Jess, maybe you can give a little insight, and then we'll have Dylan weigh into as well. However, this is separate. This informational research event is separate from the company itself. And so I know that the company would be happy to set up a follow-up call and go through the protocol in detail, maybe for informational purposes. But why don't we have Jess, can you give an overview of the training duration, what was done, how much time was spent in the individual sessions for the athletes while they were doing that? And Dylan, maybe you can chime in too as well.
Yeah, I definitely would. If you want more in-depth detail about the training protocol, talk to FlexPro Grip, because I don't work for FlexPro Grip, but I do know that they had their A, B, and C days. Again, all of which maintained radial deviation, ulnar deviation, flexion, and extension. And they trained 3 times a week. And again, those were those A, B, and C days. Their measurements were calculated based off of their fastball velocity. And so they had a progressive on-load or on-ramping training. So they started very low with the amount that they would grip, and they would increase progressively throughout that 10 weeks. And I know that they would still train after the fact, but I strictly stuck to that 10-week protocol. But I guess FlexPro Grip can speak more on the nuances of the training program and the specific movements and measurements that are made there.
And I can provide
Dylan,
a little bit of that extra specificity there. The A day is specifically going after the FDP tendon. The B day is more of the extension and radial ulnar deviation, and the C day is more mid-finger flexion. All of the training protocols are utilizing a 1-rep max, and then training maxes based off of a percentage of that. And the whole purpose is to ensure that we're meeting a sufficient level of percent MVC with our training reps, that we are able to induce the stiffness adaptation in that flexor tendon is really what the ultimate goal of the protocol is.
Ryan, can you chime in just on take what Dylan said and how you take this into your practice, how you take this into developing your programs, developing your arm care? How do you incorporate this?
Yeah, I think I would say it really depends. I know a lot of our teams, they also use FlexPro Grip, so that makes it very easy. They work really well hand in hand. And in the chance that they don't, I think you can use a lot of these same principles, training not using the device. And really, to Dylan's point, if you're loading that muscle tendon unit with enough load, then you're going to get that adaptation over time. And I think that's the key on like how you're dosing it in. So I think this protocol is great. And the ability to dose it in and then allow that muscle tendon unit to recover and adapt and then reload it.
And can you speak on not just the dosing, but the role of isotonic contraction, isometric, how we're challenging the muscles? And Ryan, why don't you go first? And then Dylan, you also have some background from your strength and conditioning side too as well. Is there a more beneficial way to attack this musculature?
Yeah, I think we're still really early, probably too early to know. And I think you guys are all leading the way in terms of the research. And it seems like at least the initial research that I've went through is this isometric contraction is very effective at specifically loading the tendon aspect of it. And just kind of, if you think about it, it's like if you stretch a muscle tendon unit or activate a muscle tendon unit, likely the stress, how much stress is going to the tendon is going to depend on how much contraction there is in that muscle. So if you can create a really stiff muscle, now that tendon is accepting more of that load and you can truly load that portion of it. And so I don't think I can give you a clear answer on the eccentric versus concentric versus isometric, but of the research that's out there, it seems like isometric is doing a very good job in terms of loading it. And then also, as you can see in Jess's research, improving that stiffness and decreasing some of that gapping that happens at the medial elbow.
And I think there is some research that has shown like concentric, eccentric, isometric, all as long as they're above the percent threshold, I think they can induce the changes. I think the nice thing about the isometrics is that one, it kind of comes with a lower fatigue cost. Two, it's an easier way to kind of meet the time thresholds. A lot of the research points to like at least 3 seconds of tension being held on the tendon. And so isometrics is a nice way to do that, whereas you don't have to worry about changing joint ranges of motion and tendon lengths and all of that fun stuff. And then lastly, it's something that can easily fit into anybody's routine. And like I said, FlexPro Grip is a device that allows you to easily do it, but you don't need the device to come up with creative ways to try to stimulate the tendons. It's just a way that allows you to measure it and be a little bit more precise in both terms of like joint positioning and intensity.
And for those purposes, Dylan, I also like it too in the post-operative period. It makes me feel more comfortable introducing some of these strengthening activities earlier than we have traditionally, because I don't have quite as much concern with regards to joint positioning and motion there. And we can dose it, right? That's what one of the values here is, that we can measure, we can dose it, and we can really expose them to the stress they're going to need to see, but in an earlier and controlled. So, Jess, we do have a couple of follow-up questions about the study itself, which I think are important. In particular, there was one attendee who asked about, do we have any follow-up? Was there any longitudinal follow with regards to how the decreased gapping played out for injury throughout the season? Did we reassess their joint gapping towards the end of the year? Were these changes sustained? And also there was some question about the cohorts itself. Can you give a little more info? Were they from the same team or from various collegiate teams with regards to their initial division?
The FlexPro Grip group was one university and the control group was another. They were both within the same area. The ultrasound images were taken just once before and after that 10-week protocol. There wasn't any follow-up after the fact. However, a fun little fact from this study is that within the 10-week protocol, I had to remove 4 players from the control cohort due to them acquiring injuries throughout that 10-week protocol. Whereas in my FlexPro Grip group, there was only 1 removed because he didn't follow the FlexPro Grip protocol. So no, there was not any latter follow-up with them simply because of time. But if there were more time, that would be something interesting to assess and to analyze if that joint gapping was maintained and if that musculature size was also maintained after the fact.
And it's an important point, right, that there were different exposures in the 2 cohorts too as well. So there are some other factors that may contribute to some of the baseline changes that we're seeing, although it is a fairly confined period of time, 10 weeks, right, with the training effect. But there are limitations here, and there are opportunities for further study that I think control some of those factors. There was a question about what age should we start training these specific muscle groups. Ryan, you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, and the same thing applies to kind of armor. It's really hard to put like an age on something, just with the different variation in the development of each kid at young ages. But the fact that, to your point, same thing as post-surgical, is like the fact that if we're implementing it with isometrics, you can definitely have a much greater control of how much load we're putting through everything. And so I think as kind of the rule of thumb, like as early as they're getting serious about the sport, whether it's 11, 12 years old. I don't know what Daryl and Adam's kind of thought on it is, but I think that's a really good age to start it. And then definitely through high school, it's green light from there on out.
I think you got to get started early with the youngest athletes. We have a lot of people here from professional baseball and seeing the downstream effects of what's happening at the youth level. But I think taking ownership of keeping their shoulder and elbow healthy, I think is the biggest emphasis in these younger cohorts. Look, we're here because of Jess's research. That's what we're here to talk about. So I really want to follow up on some of the questions from the group about it. Jess, another question: were you blinded as the ultrasound tester on which players were assigned to each group when you're testing kind of pre and post 10 weeks of training? Was this blinded or unblinded?
The measurements specifically, I believe I was sort of aware. It really just said the subject number and the conditions. So honestly, not really. But for reliability specifically, I also did not know. I did a randomized number thing where I went through which cohort was I going to pick? Was I going to pick pre or post? And which participant was I going to do? So that was all completely blind, just to make sure all of my measurements were reliable, of course, and that I wasn't being biased towards any of my measurements.
How long is this an exercise day, Dylan? If we're going through an A day or a B day, can you give us some more detail there? What does it take for an athlete to sit down and complete one of the workouts?
It's about 10 minutes. So each protocol starts off with doing a 4-finger 1 rep max, and then you have training reps at a specific percentage of that. And the 10-week protocol, I believe that you used, Jess, was the strength cycle, which is just kind of the 10-week on-ramp, if you will. So it starts at 50%, works its way up to 70% over a few weeks. You do that for all 4 fingers, then you do it for each finger individually, where you do a 1 rep and then some training reps. And then that protocol exists throughout all of the exercises. It just changes which tendon we're targeting. So whether we're doing radial ulnar, mid finger, or fingertip flexion or extension, it's that same kind of 1 rep max to training percentages being held for a longer duration is kind of the way that it's set up.
I'm also now finding more and more questions in the Q&A part, not just also in the webinar chat. So again, for folks who we have not been able to get to their questions, thank you for your interest. We're going to circulate this amongst the panel and send out a transcribed question and answer, which hopefully we can address some of these. Can Ryan and Dylan weigh in on the importance of force length relationship in training the flexor pronator in extension of the fingers versus flexion, finger posturing during the delivery? Should we be attacking these muscle tendon units in certain positions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll punt this one to Dylan because I kind of was picking his brain on it not long ago. But from what we were gathering is the more you can create preset tension in that muscle tendon unit. So it would be like a finger extended and wrist extended position for a finger flexor. That was kind of essentially presetting the load. And then now the contraction would be even greater. So I'll punt that one to you, Dylan.
Yeah, I believe there was a recent paper, and Daryl may be able to circulate this post, that showed that like the standard grip dynamometer wasn't fantastic. And my argument is that this is almost like trying to measure somebody's 1 rep max squat strength from the most shortened position, which would be like a quarter squat, versus going all the way down on the squat or lengthening out the tissue as much as you can. These are 2 very different positions. And so I think the extension aspect of it is pretty important in terms of both training as well as kind of having the strength in a specific position that's more applicable to what the fingers are going through whenever you're throwing.
I think it's a great point, and we can use it as an opportunity to at least touch on some other work that we've done, Dylan, where we've looked at how flexor pronator strength may change in certain positions based off of supination versus pronated forearm positions. And so this brings up a good point, is that this is a dynamic movement. Guys are, the overhead delivery, the arm it's not a static thing. We're not laying in 30 or 90 degrees of flexion, flexing the flexor pronator mass. We've got to measure, we've got to strengthen in different positions, and people may be vulnerable in certain positions of finger length. And so it's an interesting question. I think you brought up the handheld dynamometer. There was a study done that showed, no correlation between hand grip on the grip dynamometer with injury risk. That was done in pro ball a couple years back. We've got a couple minutes left. Ryan, any final thoughts as we start to wind down here?
Nothing specifically that comes to mind other than just being excited, like I kind of mentioned in the initial aspect of, I think it's going to be great to really put a ton of focus here on how we can really make the throwing arm as resilient as possible. So I know this is just an initial step, and it really opens the doors to a lot more research being done, but I think it's really exciting for the entire baseball world.
Dylan, what about you? After hearing
Yeah,
Jess's research?
I echo what Ryan said, and it's nice to see that when we come up with a training protocol that we think will make a substantial change, that it's nice to see that we have the expected effects. And I think this opens the door for a lot more questions to be answered in later studies that continues to push this needle forward for better and more resilient health for the elbow.
Jess, before you give some of your closing thoughts, I have you get a unique opportunity to ask a researcher about their work. What were your expectations going forward? Like when you started this project, what did you expect to find? Is this consistent with your true gut hypothesis, or what did you believe was going to happen?
I was a little bit skeptical. I honestly really didn't think it was going to work. And when I was running my R code and I outputted my graphs and did my ANOVAs, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, this did work. And, visually it's hard to tell on the ultrasound images, but when you really crunch those numbers and look at the statistics, it is really cool to see how different those two cohorts were. And again, when I go back, I'll go back to the slide that I absolutely love. I think this slide's really cool because it shows that those two cohorts actually did start at a very, very similar point. Again, they were both Division I collegiate athletes, but that FlexPro Grip group had such a drastic decrease as the control group really just either maybe increased a little bit or just maintained the same position. And I thought that was really, really awesome to see. I found it fascinating, honestly. But again, yeah, I really didn't think it was going to work at first. I wasn't convinced.
I agree. I mean, I think that's a really cool chart here. And there have been some questions from the chat about, what about other factors that have happened during this 10-week period, and could they also be at play? And I think it's fair, right? It's very fair. But what you do know is that there's a utilization of a 10-week structured program here, and these changes we're seeing. How can you improve this in the future? Obviously, a randomized study where some of these other environmental and exposure factors kind of fall out in the randomization. That being said, it's hard with some of the evidence that is accumulating to just randomize a group when we think that there is something that can be beneficial, that can be intervened upon, and to kind of withhold that treatment from a cohort. It's a challenging thing to do, but I think that your study is fantastic. You did a great job. I think you should really be applauded on this. And so, we're going to be respectful of everybody's time. We've got a lot of busy folks here that have joined us. And I want to thank, first of all, Jess, thank you for joining us, for presenting your work, for all the work that you did in order to put your study together and understand how hard of a study that is to perform and to execute. I think you really should be congratulated on your work. And thank you for joining us and sharing with us today. For Dylan and Ryan, thank you again for joining us, sharing your expertise. I appreciate you guys as friends and colleagues to bounce things off of and to learn from. Thank you to all the guests who joined us and who are interested. I think this is cool because we're here all for the same reason, right? We believe in doing whatever we can to help the throwing athlete population, try to find ways to support them while they're striving to push their bodies, but how can we also, help them in a way that we can decrease the injury rates that we're seeing. And we hope that this event here is one of many and will become sort of a series where we can discuss research, we can brainstorm, we can collaborate and find ways that we can improve the health of a throwing athlete. We've already got some ideas to discuss some future studies that we've done, both retrospective in nature, looking at the utilization of FlexPro Grip with regards to injury risk, and then some of the things that we hinted along with Dylan with regards to how flexor pronator strength may change in certain positions, which is from the pitch design perspective, likely of high interest to everybody here. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you for the great conversation. We're going to go ahead and go through the chat and try to answer some of the things that we were unable to get to today, which we apologize. But again, thanks for joining us. Thanks for everybody's passion here, and hope we can just continue to push the game forward.